Share this space with our guests today for this part 3 webinar of Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, focused on how federal and state climate policies subsidize corporate greenwashing, titled Would Build Back Better Burn Billions? I am very honored to share this space with Ashley McRae from the Indigenous Environmental Network, Marta Dino Arguello from Physicians for Social Responsibility in LA, Julia Bernal from Pueblo Action Alliance, Tim Judson from Nuclear Information and Resource Center Service, and Alejandria Leons from the Southwest Organizing Project. I'm also very honored to share this space with my co-moderator and colleague, Ana Isabel Baptista. My name is Leonardo Figueroa Heland. I speak to you from the unceded lands of the Lenape people in so-called New Jersey. I'm an arrivant to this region from Mesoamerica. I'm currently an associate professor of environmental policy and sustainability management at the New School University in New York City. And I once again want to welcome you to this panel. I first want to point out that if you have any questions for the panelists, please post them in the chat, whether that be on Zoom, on YouTube, Facebook, social media. We will be reading through those questions and building them into our conversations with our panelists today. This event is being recorded and broadcasted live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. If you do not want to be recorded, you may turn off your video. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the New School University is situated in the ancestral and unceded land of the Lenape, also known as Lenape-Hoking. Even as we gather virtually, we gather in relation to New York City and the New School University, which stand on the stolen and unceded land of indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed through settler colonialism, fraud, and deceit, and to this day struggle for the rematriation and restoration of their lands and lifeways. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape Nation, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations, as well as the displaced Lenape diaspora, who, notwithstanding settler colonial violence, have continued to nurture their lifeways, upon which these lands were cared for thousands of years. Also, as we honor indigenous peoples and lands, I also want to recognize the connected histories and realities of Black and indigenous oppressions, that these histories form the basis of the genocidal history that makes up the settler state of the United States. It is imperative to acknowledge that the settler colonial project and its institutions were founded on displacement and on stolen bodies of Black people from Africa. Beyond verbal recognition, this acknowledgement calls upon all of us, including the institution as a whole, to commit ourselves to dismantle the institutions of settler colonialism, white supremacy, systemic racism, patriarchy, and other forms of oppression as we work to materialize decolonization and regeneration to restore the health of Mother Earth. I also want to take the opportunity to denounce all forms of imperialism, colonialism, and militarism, wherever and whenever it happens, and whoever undertakes it or continues to exist upon its spoils. Imperial, colonial, and military violence requires relentless extractivism and energy-intense modes of economy, and it is therefore at the root of the crisis of Mother Earth. I therefore want to pay homage also to anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and self-determination struggles of resistance wherever they happen. I am, of course, here invoking Russian imperialism and the Ukrainian resistance, but I'm also invoking any and all other locations in the world where imperialism and colonialism has or continues to happen, from Turtle Island or North America to Abya Yala or Latin America and Africa, as well as Asia, where imperial and colonial powers, including Western powers and certainly the United States, alongside Russia, have sought to or continue to try to impose their will and their ways on local communities, nations, and indigenous peoples who nevertheless continue to resist and persist. I want to start with a greeting from the Soke ancestors from Mesoamerica. Hata yuksangsakui, naksakopach onpachkui. Father, Son, we greet you. Mother Earth, we ask permission of you. What you see here is a work of art by Christy Belcourt and Isaac Murdoch, Métis and Anishinaabe artist, New Beginnings. So welcome again to Hoodwinked in the Hothouse Part 3. This is part 3 of the webinar series, which was preceded by part 1, examining false corporate schemes advanced through the Paris Agreement, and part 2, Frontline Voices of Indigenous Resistance Beyond Climate False Solutions. You can check them out at the YouTube channel of the Indigenous Environmental Network. This event is co-organized and supported, as well as presented by the coalition of organizations that make up climatefallsolutions.org, including the ones that are listed in this slide. It is also made possible with the support and collaboration of the New School Environmental Policy Program and the Tishman Environment and Design Center. All right, now to the theme of today's panel. As the climate crisis has worsened, we have seen powerful corporate, governmental, and intergovernmental organizations, as well as many big green non-governmental organizations around the world and in the US, tout the value of many so-called climate solutions that fail to challenge the root causes of the environmental crisis. These so-called solutions include nuclear power, hydrogen, biofuel, bioenergy, carbon capture, use and storage, waste to energy incineration, chemical recycling, hydropower, industrial scale wind and solar, carbon markets and offsetting, net zero, geoengineering, nature-based solutions, and several other false solutions. These approaches fail to address the root cause of environmental degradation, fail to stop emissions at the source. They perpetuate environmental and social injustices and allow polluters technological and market-based pathways to continue their damaging activities, all while cloaking themselves in the discourses of sustainability, net zero, climate smart, green or clean energy, and even climate and environmental justice. This popularly touted climate solutions actually commodify nature, which is sacred, while perpetuating the entrenchment of power relations that drive the crisis of Mother Earth. Power relations based on colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, industrialism, militarism, corporatocracy, technocracy, among others. We must also be conscious that the climate crisis is just one part of a much broader disruption of Mother Earth, brought about by profoundly unequal power relations that are exploitative. Climate catastrophe is a symptom of pervasive forms of systemic environmental degradation and intersecting social injustices. The devastating consequences of centuries of widespread Earth system disruption, starting with colonialism and patriarchal extractivism, cannot be reduced to oversimplified questions of carbon management, nor can they be addressed by expanding or building back an unsustainable economy through the greenwashing of capitalism and endless economic growth. They cannot be solved either by plugging into the existing grid of power new techno fixes or new sources of energy without challenging and dismantling the concentration of power itself, its inequities, and its brutal scale. We should therefore resist the tempting but dangerously distracting belief that there's a quick exit from this crisis. We should resist reductionist false solutions that facilitate the continuation and expansion of the power relations that have brought us to this point. In this moment, with the latest IPCC report issuing its most dire warning yet about the clear and present dangers and harms of climate change, and with the specter of imperialism, militarism, and geopolitical competition on the rise, once again, We cannot afford to invest further social energy or funds on fossil solutions that are bought and traded on the backs of environmental justice communities, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities across the world. We therefore need to support, amplify, and make space for communities and movements that are grassroots and that embody real solutions. Instead of real solutions, however, what we're seeing are emboldened attempts by global governance institutions, governments, fossil fuel, petrochemical, agro-industry, mining, and many other industries to embed themselves squarely into current or future climate mitigation solutions. And that is what this panel seeks to center. With federal and state governments poised to provide billions of dollars in climate subsidies, policy incentives, and tax breaks to dangerous and dirty energy industries like biomass and waste incinerators, nuclear power and carbon capture and storage, infrastructure for fossil fuels facilities, frontline and environmental justice communities across the world are faced with increasing burdens and toxic threats. We highlight here the threats of climate false solutions across US federal and state policy, featuring our organizers, community leaders, researchers, and frontline organizations that are fighting the myths associated with these false solutions. We must effectively move money away from such dangerous policy directions and towards real climate justice solutions. We need our allies amongst national green groups, labor unions, climate philanthropy, and policymakers to join frontline communities in opposing these schemes. I now want to open the space for my co-moderator, Ana Baptista, to provide further context on the US federal and state level policies.
Thank you, Leo, and welcome everyone. I am Ana Isabel Baptista. I'm also on Lenape-Hoking land in so-called New Jersey. And I help run a center here at the new school called the Tishman Environment and Design Center. And I'm very happy to be with these amazing panelists today and to help set the scene a little bit about the context in which we're talking about false solutions here. Most of my work is engaged with doing advocacy and policy work directly with EJ communities right here in my region, but also across the country. And I see firsthand many of the impending dangers that are already here and continue to get exacerbated through state and federal climate policy. So I by no means want to set a comprehensive picture, because I think our panelists will do an amazing job of digging deep into the real world consequences and cases of what we're seeing in terms of false solutions. But wanted to just highlight some things that are in the foreground for our conversation. So both the federal and state governments and many of the policies that these different scales of government are pushing through subsidies, direct investments, and legal tools are propping up so-called climate mitigation strategies that are grounded in false solutions, as you heard from Leo. And this is, of course, further supported by philanthropy as well. I'm not going to talk about philanthropy here today, but we all know that, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Harvard are, and Bezos are all investing deeply in the billions of dollars in similar false solutions. But let's take for a minute the federal government and the state of very weak environmental laws. The Trump administration rolled back where we're already very porous environmental protections, particularly for environmental justice and frontline communities. This administration, unfortunately, has continued to provide direct support through subsidies and policy incentives to these dangerous and dirty false solutions. For example, this administration is still putting on the table weakening of the National Environmental Policy Act to speed up permitting reviews for things like pipelines to deliver CO2 sequestration facilities. They're continuing to open up oil and gas wells. The Biden administration actually accelerated this permitting and approved over 3,500 permits for oil and gas drilling on public lands, nearly 2,000 of them through the BLM on public lands. The federal government actually just paused many of these permits because of the Supreme Court ruling that's impending on the social cost of carbon. So that decision will also sort of loom over many of these weakening of current environmental laws. In addition to that, we have major climate advisors like Gina McCarthy, who's the senior White House advisor, attending the UN climate talks and going around touting things like carbon capture and sequestration, touting nuclear, basically saying that the administration has an all of the above approach to climate change. Basically, she sat on a panel actually with the Louisiana governor and fossil fuel industries touting how CCS was going to keep this fossil fuel industry alive for the next 20 years, so not to worry. And that was her reassurance to the audience. And one of the primary ways actually that the administration has previously and continues to push false solutions is through the tax code. For example, under tax code section 45Q, little known tax code, I'm sure none of us have ever read, over $2.3 billion is going to CCS technologies and will continue to grow. There's continuing efforts to actually grow the amount of tax code subsidies that are going directly to this. And this is despite a very poor track record on CCS. You know, the Department of Energy spent over $1 billion on CCS demonstration projects. Only 3 of them actually captured any carbon. 2 of them actually ended up shutting down of the 3. So despite that, these failures, the administration is hell-bent on continuing to prop up this particular industry around CCS and hydrogen through the infrastructure bill and through what they were hoping was going to be a very large infusion of cash through the Build Back Better bill. When Build Back Better fell apart and reconciliation talks fell apart, they turned to the infrastructure bill that was recently passed to really try to kickstart the CCS industry and the hydrogen industry. And of course, the fear is that Justice 40, this initiative that was supposed to carve out 40% of quote unquote benefits to disadvantaged communities, that many of these false solutions like CCS are going to be touted as the benefits that the federal government is delivering to communities. And I was just going to share just a few slides with you just to highlight, and I won't go through all of these because I'm happy to share them afterwards with all of you. I was just going to share a few highlights from the infrastructure bill for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of spending a lot of time with it. But it's really like a giveaway to these false solutions. We're talking about $3.5 billion to develop 4 regional commercial scale direct capture hubs. And they've already been targeting areas like Louisiana, where there's the oil and gas industry and existing pipeline infrastructure to prop up that industry. They're also putting in over $2.5 billion into large-scale carbon sequestration and storage commercialization. And one of the most chilling ones is the millions of dollars that's going to HBCUs and minority-serving institutions to quote unquote create the next generation of geoengineers and scientists who will participate in this false solution economy. So there's a lot of different ways that then this funding that comes out of the infrastructure bill trickles down into states, and the states themselves will continue the support for these subsidies through many things like tax incentives, in direct financial assistance, but also in the form of what are like offtake agreements, which basically requires utilities to enter into these agreements with power plants that have carbon capture technology and provides guaranteed buyers for this electricity. And then they turn around and they authorize the utility to pass on the cost of this to the ratepayers. So not only are we paying for it in the infrastructure bill, we'll end up paying for it as ratepayers as well. And this continues, with hydrogen. Maybe some of the panelists are going to talk about the hydrogen hubs. There's over $8 billion in the infrastructure bill to create these regional hydrogen hubs. I've been hearing from folks in New York State and Louisiana and Minnesota and many parts of the country that are being targeted for these hydrogen hubs. And basically, all that we know about hydrogen is that it is very, very bad and all in a way to really prop up the fossil fuel industry. And not to be forgotten, nuclear gets a bite at this apple as well. There's $6 billion to prevent retirement of nuclear plants when we should be actually closing them down. We're giving them more money to keep them alive. And there are many other examples like this, and states are following suit as well. For example, 14 states have passed laws, basically legislation that the American Chemistry Council has written for them, that exempts chemical recycling facilities, basically plastic incinerators, from solid waste recycling laws. And then renewable portfolio standards that many states, 32 states have renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards. They too are looking at the inclusion of CCS, hydrogen, in addition to waste incineration and nuclear and large hydro. So these are just a few ways in which the stage is being set to prop up false solutions across the policy landscape. And we are very lucky to have the opportunity today to hear from panelists with firsthand experience tackling these false solutions. And so I want to really turn the stage over to them to be able to share with us some of these emerging threats, these false solutions and their impacts on communities, and really some of the responses that they are initiating and seeing on the horizon. So I'm gonna turn it, I think, first over to Tim Judson, who's going to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about the picture of false solutions where he is. Tim, I think you're on mute, so you just have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that, everybody. And so thanks, Ana Isabel, and everyone for being here tonight and sharing your Wednesday evening with us as we take you down the rabbit hole of these false solutions. I'm going to talk a bit about the role that nuclear power plays in all this. And I'm speaking to you tonight from Onondaga Nation land, where the city of Syracuse is located. I'm about a mile from Onondaga Lake, which is the place where the Great Law of Peace was founded and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was formed, which is really a world historical place that has been contaminated by industrial pollution now for over 100 years. And it's the most polluted body of water in North America, which is, I think, provides some context for how I come to this work and what we do with my organization. With the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, we're a small national organization that was founded 44 years ago to be a sort of a resource networking and resource hub for grassroots organizations and frontline communities that are impacted by nuclear power and radioactive waste. And we work for a nuclear-free, carbon-free world. What we see really sort of from the perspective of nuclear power as a false solution is that nuclear power is really used by the energy industry, by the utility industry, and by federal government to essentially lock in the dirty energy status quo. And all the rhetoric that we hear about nuclear energy as a climate solution is really, an effort to distract from what are better solutions to the climate crisis, and more broadly, to be able to end the dirty energy status quo that we're confronted with. In terms of nuclear power and climate, what we say is that nuclear power is too dirty, too dangerous, too expensive, and too slow, but that it's also rooted in environmental racism and human rights violations across the nuclear fuel chain, and also looking forward into future generations. The nuclear industry targets indigenous peoples and communities of color for uranium extraction and radioactive waste. There's very serious disparities in terms of the way that radiation affects women more than men, and so there's real gender disparities and human rights violations in that. And then there's just significant intergenerational harm in the kind of forever contamination and health problems that result from radioactive pollution. So, we sort of look at this in terms of the whole nuclear fuel chain, which starts with uranium extraction, which disproportionately, both in the US and around the world, targets indigenous lands for extraction. To give you kind of a sense of the scale of that, for every pound of fuel that goes into a reactor, uranium mining produces 5,000 tons of, for every pound of nuclear fuel that goes in a reactor, there's 5,000 pounds of radioactive and toxic waste that's produced, in the uranium mining process. So we're talking about a mountain of waste that's created mostly in indigenous communities before there's even a kilowatt hour of electricity generated. That continues through the fuel chain until you end up with every pound of fuel that goes into a nuclear power plant comes out several years later, intensely radioactive and dangerous to human health and the environment for 1 million years and more. This is not clean energy by any stretch of the imagination. Indigenous communities are targeted throughout the fuel chain. There's over 15,000 abandoned uranium mines in the US. That's more abandoned uranium mines than we have McDonald's in this country. And those are disproportionately up to 50 to 75% on indigenous lands. And then that follows through to the end where, where Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are targeted for radioactive waste consistently throughout the last 50 years. As we're seeing, in Ukraine right now, the reality of that the nuclear power is dangerous is sort of inescapable. We have not only several, historical catastrophes, but we have, a growing likelihood of them coming in the years, and decades to come, through the intersection of nuclear power and climate change. The rising sea levels, extreme weather events and whatnot consistently, impact nuclear sites around the country and around in other parts of the world. And this is a danger that the nuclear industry is consistently trying to sweep under the rug. Nuclear power is too expensive. We've seen this happen throughout the decades-long sort of failure of the nuclear industry to be able to actually, to produce power at an affordable cost. The industry has relied on bailouts now for decades, federal and state bailouts for decades. And that really sort of contrasts with what's happening with renewable energy sources, which are only becoming less and less expensive, while nuclear power is only getting more and more expensive. And this is despite the fact that nuclear energy has received disproportionate subsidies, throughout the last 70 years of its existence. And then while we know we have a 2030 deadline for being able to really address the climate crisis, it takes far more than 10 years to even build a single nuclear power plant, which has been the case in the US and other countries for decades now. So there's really no way in which nuclear power can play a role in solving the climate crisis, just on a practical level, that they just can't build nuclear power plants fast enough, and all the existing reactors are getting too old to continue operating. So there's a real climate justice cost to promoting nuclear power, and we've seen this happen, over the last several years, both in bailing out old reactors, like what New York did a few years ago, where they're spending charging ratepayers $7.6 billion in subsidies to old reactors, when they could have actually saved ratepayers $3 billion by investing in energy efficiency instead. To where we also have the new reactors that are being built in Georgia at a cost of over $33 billion now, and over 15 years of construction from when they first were being planned. And if the utilities in Georgia had invested in renewable energy and energy efficiency instead, that ratepayers would actually be saving money and the environment would be healthier because of it. But instead, they're building a nuclear power plant and continuing to burn fossil fuels all along the way. Some of the current fights that are happening are we have a number of different fights actually on pretty much every front as a result of the push to kind of promote nuclear power as a solution to climate change. We have pushed to expand uranium extraction in the US. We have, the proposal to create a domestic uranium reserve, which is just a bailout to nuclear mining corporations. while we completely neglecting the need to clean up abandoned uranium mines. And we also have the situation where a bill to compensate communities that were affected by uranium mining and nuclear weapons testing is about to expire at the end of the year, when that needs to be renewed and expanded. And this is really sort of we're down to a fight over the next 4 months to renew and expand that legislation. We've got fights over nuclear waste happening, both in terms of Latino communities in the Southwest that are being targeted for massive nuclear waste dumps right now, as well as fights with the industry over proposals to deregulate so-called low-level radioactive waste, and then a move by the industry to move into a sort of a for-profit approach to decommissioning and cleaning up nuclear power plant sites. In terms of old reactors or existing reactors, we've got $17 billion of subsidies from several states going to these old nukes. $6 billion, as Anna Isabel mentioned, going to the DOE is just about to sort of roll out the door for some of these uneconomical reactors. But also we still have a proposal alive in Congress to provide $35 to $58 billion in tax credits to these old reactors that is expected to be part of the climate package from Build Back Better that may move forward. There's also, they're trying to establish nuclear power plants as the sites for hydrogen hubs and pipelines, and then also to continue running these reactors by relicensing them out to 80 years. In terms of new nuclear reactors, there's a whole bunch of subsidies and demonstration projects that the Department of Energy is promoting in several states. There are proposals related to those to produce new and more dangerous kinds of enriched uranium that are really sort of dangerous nuclear weapons proliferation issues as well. And then also to streamline the licensing process for these for these new reactors, which could actually be incredibly dangerous in terms of nuclear safety standards. They're also talking about lifting export restrictions on nuclear technologies, and the US is cutting deals with several states, including Ukraine, to export nuclear reactors to those countries as well. And this is all tied up in geopolitics with Russia and China as well. And then there's several state policy fights that are happening this year, where there's proposals to repeal decades-old state bans on constructing new nuclear power plants, as well as promoting ratepayer financing of these projects. And then a new move, which is to kind of promote nuclear power as sort of a replacement for coal and building new nuclear power plants on coal plant sites. And these fights are all playing out in various states this year, and there's a list of those and some of the links that are going to get shared later. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Tim. I'm gonna thank you for taking us through that presentation, and I'm gonna turn it over to Martha now to share with us some of her experiences with Fall Solutions as well.
So good evening, everybody. Marta Dinarguello with Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles on Tongva land. And I'm going to start with a PowerPoint and then sort of just really share what the experience has been like for us in California, addressing, dealing with what I'm very politely calling a shitstorm of bad climate policy. And I've been involved in California's climate policy since 2005 and maybe before, but have watched, AB 32, which is called California's landmark climate policy that begat cap and trade and a low carbon fuel standard that continues now being a plan for reaching 2030 and 45 targets that rests entirely on almost entirely on carbon capture and sequestration. And just in the last 2 weeks, I think we as a movement felt the pun intended, the explosion of proposals from the city, as well as funds in the budget and in other places for the hydrogen rainbow. And I often feel like we are trying to stop a really well-funded and well-coordinated moving train that is being facilitated by the fossil fuel industry and a really problematic relationship with the labor community. So we have been, in California, we have been fighting back on this idea from when Brown was in office, calling to question his real climate leadership. And we're still doing the same with the current governor, who is very good at doing things that are formative, like showing up in our communities and saying and declaring that they will establish a 3,200-foot setback, but ignoring main concerns that we wanted it to address existing wells. So we're accustomed to being thrown under the bus. But I'm going to tell you, in my 20 years of doing this work, it really has felt incredibly intense. And we are fighting these battles at all levels, right? From communities that are already facing permitting to the work that many of us, including the California Environmental Justice Alliance and many groups, over 20 environmental justice organizations who are part of working on the scoping plan, which is the California Air Resources Board, our air regulators, plan for achieving net zero and even negative carbon emissions. So the entire scoping plan is framed as a net zero document. And we know that net zero will beget a lot of false solutions that actually don't reduce emissions. And they represent a huge loss of opportunity to actually implement and fund community-driven solutions. So the advocacy of the environmental justice communities in California is at the scoping plan level, which is with the California Air Resources Board, at the California legislature, both at the budget level, trying to move monies in better directions. But, tomorrow morning, there is a hearing on carbon capture and sequestration in the Senate. And the majority of the speakers come from mainstream groups, and we're not, that all feel like, at some point or another, we're going to need carbon capture and sequestration. And that, it just continues to be a huge threat. So these are some of the threats that we are, as we've talked about, there's money and the fossil fuel industry wants to not only continue its current subsidies, but expand them by getting more money to do carbon capture and sequestration. And there's, as you can see in California, we forget that there's lots of refineries, lots of production, and there's even plans to reopen facilities. A facility that was shut down in a community in the Central Valley through community activism is now being threatened to be open as a biomass facility. So what we do know, one of the things that we've had to rush into doing is really working with Physicians for Social Responsibility, our national network of physicians, and we've started to really dig into being able to push back on the information. One, establish what are the health impacts that we should be thinking about as we talk about carbon capture and sequestration, everything from what happens along the pipeline to the production, but also when you are pulling out carbon from a refinery, does it leave and what we're finding is that it takes the carbon, but leaves the air pollution. And so we'll actually increase localized air pollution for both communities and workers. So we're really worried about this. So the other thing that we talked about and we heard earlier is we don't do well with forever stewardship, right? We certainly know that through our experience around nuclear weapons and nuclear waste and nuclear energy. And carbon capture calls for this permanent kind of storage that we don't know how to do. And most storage systems that we've developed eventually leak. So I was going to try to say this another way, but I'm kind of pissed. And so what we feel like in these regulatory spaces and in these legislative spaces is they're pissing on our heads and telling us it's raining. And so it's a crude way of saying that at this point, what we have heard from the legislator is that facts don't matter, that the political forces have aligned to push and support carbon capture and sequestration. And in California, some are seeing this as a way to declare victory on climate by saying that they've cut a deal with labor who supports climate policies. But as long as those climate policies extend the life of fossil fuels, they're there. So I think, this is, tremendously difficult politics. And, we are, sorry, I'm moving in the wrong direction. It's a really difficult politics. What we've done in California is actually created a coalition and we've got sort of a multi-pronged approach. We're going to engage and watch the legislation, the legislative efforts, build a broader coalition, and be able to push back both at CARB and the legislature, but also fight in the court of public opinion. We know that folks are like, oh, this thing sounds really good, this shutback that will suck up all this pollution. But once people start asking some of these questions that our communities have been asking, what does this do? What are the impacts on water? What are the impacts on energy use? Do these things actually work? That information is critical, and it is not getting into communities in a way that's meaningful. And so part of what we're doing is challenging these ideas of net zero targets, and also supporting each other with information and building the capacity for our organizations to engage in the long haul. And almost everything that I just said about carbon capture is now sort of emerging around proposals for green hydrogen. And we've also been sort of put in the situation where this wave of bad stuff is happening. At the same time, we're barely figuring out, well, what is this stuff? How do we come to it? How do we take a position on this? And my feeling is, if it extends the life of the fossil fuels, if it's a project that is being funded primarily and the PR for it is coming out of the fossil fuel industry, we should just, as a matter of principle, say no and figure out how we build the people power to stop this. Because I think that the thing with CCS and green hydrogen and these other things is that it's used as a way to paint us as unreasonable. And so, in some ways, what we've done with the scoping plan as a movement is say, here are all the things that we think you should do right now for direct emissions reductions that also improve air quality, because I always say carbon is the co-pollutant. And so the environmental justice community as a whole has come together to start doing, presenting CARB with a better path toward the reductions that we need, and trying to argue for those investments going in to support alternatives, and finding the usage, if the cement industry can reduce its emissions by 50% without carbon capture, well, then what are the ways that we get to that other 50% without the carbon capture, right? Can we really figure out, working with engineers and others about how to use hempcrete and what are the right uses for it? We know that in big projects, infrastructure projects, it may be difficult, but we need to figure out a better solution there. And it's sort of interesting that some of the cement industry folks are like, we don't need carbon capture and sequestration. We can get those reductions in another way. And the proponents are like, no, you can't. So, I mean, that's sort of an example of the extent to which this is now dogma, and that at the end of the day, this is no longer about the science. It is really about figuring out ways to extend the life of fossil fuel industries. So even the conversation about hydrogen and its limited uses, what we are ignoring when we try to sound reasonable and say, well, maybe it's got these limited applications, that is not what the industry wants. The industry does not want small applications of green hydrogen that's produced with electrolysis, not major central station power, but that's produced on site, doesn't have to travel long to be used. That's not what the plans are for. The plans are for large scale hydrogen production that we may not be ready to do for a while. So how will gas infrastructure then be used while we figure out how to get to the hydrogen economy? Sorry, I realized I was sharing I don't know that I was sharing my screen all this time for my slides, but.
No, we didn't see your slides, but that's okay. I think we have a way of sharing slides afterwards with all the participants. So if that's okay with you, Martha.
Yes, that's okay. I think the last thing I want to say is, how do we stop a moving train without having to stand in front of it? It is really about people power, being sort of relentless. And one of the examples of a victory that many people thought we would never get to was, in December, the City Council of Los Angeles voted to move a motion forward that would declare all oil extraction in the city of Los Angeles a non-conforming land use. That is, you can no longer do it as a matter of right. When we started that campaign, many people said, you'll never get that, just get better regulations, you'll never, and we didn't. We actually asked for 2,500-foot setback. When talking to communities who are living fence line and front lines to extraction and the refineries, the community just said, we don't want these here anymore. Figure out what you need to do. And so for over 10 years, we've organized and mobilized and pushed back on the city council, pushed back when they wanted to say, well, we'll do a ban on fracking. Well, that's not what's happening in low-income communities and communities of color. So that will make many people happy who are national fractivists, but it will not solve the problems for the people living, within 500 feet of an oil well. And I think folks don't, what happens in LA doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, right? Where you can put your hand outside your window and you are in the airspace of a drill site that's using highly toxic chemicals, right? In very dense population. And so that is our lesson, right? Be, solid in your messaging, solid in our conviction that we can get to what we want, and not letting, the electeds off the hook. And when they finally signed it, every council person, it was a unanimous vote, and it took a long time, but I'm telling you, they're rushing through the hydrogen proposal, right? They called us with less than 8 hours to comment on their motion, and we said no. But it did send us into this, like, what should we say? Should we say maybe in this, because we're trying to be reasonable. And I think there is no being reasonable when you're trying to extend the life of fossil fuel. It is not reasonable to do that. And so I think we should worry less about that, especially at these policy tables where somehow to be at the table, you have to be willing to give something up. And, more and more I feel that we can't, because as folks have said already, what's at stake is the health of our communities and our ability to address climate before it gets any worse for our communities. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences there. I'm gonna ask Alejandria if she could join us and share some of her experiences working with SWAP.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, so my name is Alejandria Lyons. I am a Chicana organizer working with the Southwest Organizing Project. I am their environmental justice organizer, and we are located in Southern Tiwa Territory, also known as Albuquerque, New Mexico. So the Southwest Organizing Project, or SWAP, has been around for a little over 40 years. We came out of the Chicano movement. And so, a lot of the documents, such as the letter to the Big Ten, which is a point in time that I think is very relevant 32 years ago, where many organizations, here in New Mexico and regionally were calling out greenwashing, these false solutions back then that we are still having to continue to talk about, and how they are primarily taking money from folks who are still funding the climate crisis, right? Exxon, Shell, all these lobbyists who are behind these false solutions. And so, New Mexico is not, we know all about this. We have been dubbed a sacrifice zone for eons since the US came in and tried to take the territories away from both the Tewa, Tiwa, and other indigenous folks here, as well as some of the land-based Acequia communities, kind of like where my family comes from. So, here in New Mexico, we've been fighting hydrogen, we've been fighting net zero, cap and trade, a lot of this carbon sequestration. I mean, we just got through our state legislative session where our grassroots groups that included SWAP, Pueblo Action Alliance, and Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, and of Earth Care, which are all regionally based local groups that work on different scales, as well as regionally and locally, and all us to swap nationally and internationally, right? And so I got involved through being part of a group, It Takes Roots, that went to the Conference of Parties, so COP26. And, you know, for a long time, you know, that this group has been fighting Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement, right? Because there at COP, we saw that the largest outfit and many of the people who were there were the fossil fuel industry, were nuclear, were all these people who were going ahead and making these closed door deals that we're seeing trickle down through our federal governments into our state now, that are part of the infrastructure and jobs bill, right? So bringing it back regionally to New Mexico, we fought 5 different hydrogen bills, and this includes the blue, the green, the gray hydrogen. And essentially what that is it's relies on hydrocarbons, it relies on natural fuel, on natural gas, petroleum. And as Marta had mentioned, this is just the lifeline for the fossil fuel industry. So a lot of the EJ and climate groups fought very diligently to kill these bills. But now what we are seeing, that through this infrastructure, this 2021 infrastructure and jobs bill, is that our governor has gone behind the backs of many of our people and signed a memorandum, an MOU with Colorado, with Utah and Wyoming to access some of this hydrogen hub money, right? And it's none of our frontline communities that want this. And if you look at the MOU, I'll throw the document in, you know, they try to say that we want frontlines to be protected, that they're going to go ahead and make sure that there is air quality and there is all these different other, you know, guardrails to protect communities of color, but it's false. If that was the case, then, you know, we would have seen cleanup of nuclear. We would have seen cleanup for uranium in our Dene lands. And so that is yet to happen. And so, you know, this is just the continuation of false solutions being proposed. I mean, so this is that $8 billion of unproven technology. And so for a while now in New Mexico, we've been pushing for renewables, actual renewables, so solar and wind, because we know that that is technology. But unfortunately, because there is no federal backing behind like the money and the infrastructure for things such as hydrogen, we're not seeing it. And, you know, it is unfortunate that we are at ends talking about jobs, because our state is heavily reliant on oil and gas production. I mean, it's tied with our schools because, you know, there's just a few populations, and that gets to, again, you know, them looking at us as a sacrifice zone. So we're tied to oil and gas. I mean, you know, we have the Permian Basin in New Mexico, and they're trying to stop no new leases, right? But it continues. And so I think to say the real harms are the continuation of greenwashing, investing in unproven technologies such as offsetting, because, you know, we're talking about the climate disaster, and that is 100% what we need to get behind. But we also need to think about the cultural lifeways that these will affect. I know Julia is going to talk a little bit about this, but, you know, for those of us that come from land-based communities, like the Acequia communities that live along the middle Rio Grande here in New Mexico, I mean, hydrogen is going to use a bunch of water, and nobody has talked about that. And that will completely destroy the subsistence farming and the folks who really live off the land. I mean, that has happened in so many other states, or, you know, and this doesn't even include the fact of, you know, New Mexico is facing a huge drought that is now the new norm. And so, again, you know, we're fighting hydrogen, we're fighting net zero, because, again, it just goes against everything that we have been taught as frontline people of color. And it goes against our morals. And so, I think that the thing that we've been doing now is to call this out, to protect our querencia, what is sacred, our love of the land, and, include these really large analysis, right? So SWAP for a long time has called a lot of these things out because this is the legacy of colonialism. I mean, New Mexico was colonized several times by the Spanish and then Mexico and then the United States. And we have always been seen as last, and that's why we are a sacrifice zone. And so whenever we're talking about these false solutions, we have to continue to talk about no sacrifice zones, because we cannot build a regenerative economy if we are not prioritizing these cultural lifeways. So I'm gonna just leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alejandria, for sharing with us all your wisdom and expertise in this area. I'm going to ask Julia if she could join us and also share with us some of her thoughts and introduce herself to the participants tonight.
Okay, herkam makawam hino makima tataikum kitupaf tatushutoyai. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Julia Bernal. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the director for Pueblo Action Alliance. I'm calling in from Sandia Pueblo, otherwise known as Tushutoyai, the Green Reed Place. We're one of the 20 pueblos within New Mexico and Texas. And I also am Yuchi from the Sapulpa area in Oklahoma on my mother's side. And I've been working with PAA, or Pueblo Action Alliance, for the past 5 years now, a little over 5 years. And our first kind of original intent of the organization was really to aid communities or aid the Standing Rock movement. And after, learning about that movement and the founders of the organization, invited me into the space and really envisioned bringing a lot of, what we learned there back here in New Mexico, because so-called New Mexico is a very resource-rich region, not just New Mexico, but the Southwest in total is a very resource-rich region. Many indigenous peoples have called this place home since time immemorial and continue a legacy of resistance against settler colonialism. And this resistance is continued today in the forms of climate and environmental justice. A lot of the challenges that we face as indigenous people is that extractive colonialism is really impacting and threatening our cultural integrity as indigenous peoples. We have continued our lifeways through our original instructions, which is to be in reciprocity with the natural world and utilize our own original instructions to steward this land and these water bases. And that is what we continue to do through our capacity at Pueblo Action Alliance. We have been fighting against the federal fossil fuel leasing program under the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and of course under the Department of the Interior for the past 5 years as well. Alejandria did a really great job of kind of laying out the landscape of what so-called New Mexico is against, but it really is this historic legacy and continuation of the fossil fuel economy. In the 1970s, President Nixon had deemed the San Juan region, which is the north western corner of so-called New Mexico, as an energy sacrifice zone, and that legacy and attitude towards this region continues on into the Permian Basin, which is now one of, if not the largest oil field in the so-called Americas. And so we're emitting just an enormous amount of methane into the air, as well as other greenhouse gases, which is, causing a greenhouse effect to not just New Mexico, but all over the world. Here in New Mexico, we're an arid to semi-arid environment, but now we're in this continuous aridification of the landscape, meaning that our water resources are becoming more and more depleted. And so the stressors on water resources also is directly connected to how the state is trying to introduce new economies that continue the fossil fuel era. And we're seeing that in many different forms. I guess I just want to like also just go back to how we got involved in this work, particularly because, you know, for a long time we really did just focus on fracking and oil and gas and addressing the fossil fuel leasing program under the Department of the Interior. We know that there is a global movement to create a just transition, and so that does put pressure on oil and gas. And so in 2019, PAA, we were invited by the Indigenous Environmental Network to be a part of their carbon pricing pilot program. We met in Chicago, and that was really like the first time that I learned like about false solutions. And it blew my mind because I knew that it was going to come to New Mexico. I was like, well, this is just like, you know, this has written New Mexico Energy Sacrifice Zone continuation written all over it. And so we really did do a deep dive into how New Mexico is perpetuating these false solutions. So after we came back from Chicago, we looked into like where the state of New Mexico is situated in all of this. We found out that New Mexico is a part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is this body of states that are coming together to align with the Paris Climate Agreement and promote market-based solutions. And these market-based solutions are supposed to mitigate climate change, but we all know that the system that we live in now was not created for Indigenous people, so therefore it was not created with any sort of Indigenous worldview whatsoever. And it really is about commodifying what we all hold sacred. And this is a continued commodification. Now we're seeing the commodification of clean air. New Mexico had set out several climate goals, one being that they were going to try and decrease their emissions and greenhouse gases by 45% under their 2005 goal, or under their 2005 emissions cap by 2030. This goal for them was going to be accomplished through market-based mechanisms. And so what does that mean for us? Does that mean that we're going to complete this just transition to solar or to wind? And the answer is really no. It's about crutching the fossil fuel economies, and it's being done through, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, carbon capture, storage, and offsetting schemes, achieve net zero, and then of course the introduction of hydrogen production. We are already seeing offsetting programs happening in New Mexico currently, and unfortunately it's through the lands of Indigenous nations. Unfortunately, Mescalero Apache have already signed a contract with these green middle guys who are commodifying their forests to create carbon credit programs. This is something that I just can't get on board with, because my understanding in terms of climate dynamics is that it's virtually impossible to quantify how much carbon is sequestered in certain areas, because there are many parameters that you have to consider in order to do that. Soil health is one, elevation, temperature, are all factors that you have to equate into certain equations and formulas to really understand like how much carbon is being sequestered in these so-called sinks. And so it really just does play to this idea that all of these markets are completely made up, and they're made up to benefit only few. They're only there to benefit the consolidated wealth of the world. And we're seeing that continue to happen now. And this goes against, again, all of our values as Indigenous people. And we're coming into this moment where traditional ecological knowledge is something that is being called upon in order to create climate solutions, while at the same time creating solutions in a market-based program, therefore is commodifying indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And that's continuously happening now. And tribes are actually being coerced into thinking that these different types of land management programs that create carbon credits and offsetting credits are actually going to be something that helps, mitigate and adapt to changing climate. It's not true. And, Alejandra did speak a little bit on this, but I did want to talk about hydrogen in the sense that it's also perpetuating these public and private partnerships. And so New Mexico is really reliant on the private sector to bring in its annual revenue. And that has traditionally been done through the oil and gas industry. And so now, because there's this big movement to address climate, mitigate climate, hydrogen is now coming into talks. And our governor has really bullied a lot of our representatives into supporting hydrogen without the proper education on what types of resources are going to be utilized in order to produce hydrogen. More recently, the governor had applauded herself by entering a public-private partnership with Biotech, which is a hydrogen hub production company. And they're proposing to build a hydrogen hub right here in the Middle Rio Grande Valley, right next to my community here in San Diego Pueblo. Hydrogen is a huge water-intensive resource, or hydrogen production is very water resource intensive. And so as we're continuing this aridification throughout the Southwest, we ask, where is the water coming from? What type of infrastructure is going to be needed in order to produce hydrogen in this region? And that's where I feel like offsetting and other types of mechanisms are coming in. So, we have a huge agricultural sector here in New Mexico, and specifically here in the Rio Grande, it's not big ag, it's more traditional agriculture. So the Pueblos, who have been farming these areas since time immemorial, definitely shared a lot of their knowledge on farming and water systems to, now the Acequia communities in this area, but are now the targets in terms of fallowing initiatives. And what fallowing is it's basically state incentives to farmers to not water their fields anymore. And this to me just screams agricultural offsets, because the incentives that are given to farmers are not going to be a viable market for them, and they're going to have a supplementary market. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that any way in which that we are going to try and mitigate climate through market-based mechanisms is only going to perpetuate this global capitalist model. We have to consider models that have caps, in terms of not caps like not cap and trade, but caps in terms of ecological ceilings that don't create surplus. We need to consider economic models that are about community sharing and community management. And that essentially is decentering power. It's shifting power from those that hold the most wealth into community based action, and that's something that the grassroots really has been trying to do, but we have so many barriers in terms of these big environmental organizations endorsing things like net zero and other false solutions, and we really did see that during our legislative session. PAA, Yucca, and SWAP, we really came together to denounce false solutions, and were completely undermined by a lot of these national environmental organizations. We were even attempted to be kept out of our legislative capital. They weren't going to let Indigenous, youth, Brown organizations to come in and advocate to our representatives and legislatures. And so there's just this deep embedded racist system that we are having to fight against. But convenings like this, to where we can build power with each other and share more information and education to our community, are super vital to this to this fight, because the language that they use is very divisive. They co-opt our own language. I think Ananda was speaking about that at the last webinar that we were talking about. And so, you know, I'm just really appreciative to be here in this space today to just share information. And hopefully this is a resource that other folks can use in the future. But, you know, I also just want to like applaud the efforts that have been, you know, historically done in New Mexico, because, you know, we definitely stand on the shoulders of those that really started the environmental justice movement here in New Mexico. And now that Indigenous organizations are more involved in climate justice and environmental justice, we're seeing like a moment where Indigenous grassroots movements and Chicano movements and, you know, are really coming together to mobilize against these dominant powers and attempt to shift paradigms. So I'll leave it there, and thank you so much for giving me space today, and be sure to check out politicalalliance.org. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for sharing all of your wisdom. It was incredible depth of knowledge with us. And I'm going to turn it, last but not least, to our amazing speaker, Ashley from IEN, to share her wisdom with us before we turn it over for discussion questions. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Halaka ke, Hoisiye no lako, Nataya PAC, Natai Kopi, Solano ke. I just said hello. My name is Ashley. I'm with the Indigenous Environmental Network. I use she, they pronouns. I come from the absentee Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma. I'm also Oglala and Chichangu Lakota, and I'm currently calling in from Wajaji territories, also known as Osage Res, in so-called Oklahoma, just about 30 minutes away from the pipeline crossroads of the world. And yeah, I'm just really grateful to be here today and to share this space with amazing panelists who are grassroots, community-based organizations and community leaders who are really leading the fight against false solutions. At Indigenous Environmental Network, our mission is really to uplift and center and focus on these grassroots and frontline-led solutions and fights against the climate crisis. We have a really hard line and stance against false solutions. And my job specifically, I'm not the person who really, focuses on this work, but this work really does touch all of our programs at IEN. I am the Green New Deal coordinator at IEN, and a lot of my work really does involve interfacing with these big greens that Julia was talking about, and also interfacing with congressional members and executive level members as well, to really try to get a seat at the table and to push forward these grassroots and frontline-led solutions that we really believe at IEN are really going to do the work of putting us into a regenerative economy. And so I get the fun part of kind of talking about the issues of big greens and the way that they are perpetuating false solutions in these organizational spaces. And I think it's just really important to, look back to what Alejandria was saying about how the federal policies and these federal interventions really do impact communities on the ground, whether it be in New Mexico or Louisiana or California, or the pipeline, the carbon pipeline build out that is happening up north in the Northern Plains. These very high level sort of ethereal conversations and policies really do funnel down and impact our communities on the ground. And it's really important to recognize that even though we are, under a democratic administration, that we cannot be fooled by the mask of neoliberalism. And it's really important to recognize how the presidency, how the administration, how Congress, and how some of these big greens really fit into that system of neoliberalism and perpetuate these false solutions like carbon pricing, which we really see are extensions of colonization, capitalism, and white supremacy, which I think many of the other panelists had also touched on. when the infrastructure package was happening, when those negotiations were really, breaking down, a lot of the work that we were engaged in was, in the Green New Deal Network and other spaces, coalition spaces like that, where we are pretty much the frontline representation in the circle of big greens. And that's, a really odd space to be because, we are a nonprofit organization and we are international. But when it comes to these negotiations in Congress, it really is interesting to see how different organizations that are specifically white-led organizations really play into these capitalistic systems. And like Julia said, just straight up push us out of the rooms, leave us out of the conversations. And so a lot of my job actually involves pushing back against those people. And so I'm not necessarily a friendly face in those spaces, but that's not really, our job to be friendly faces in these spaces, because we have to understand that these systems, these colonial systems, are going to cause harm unless we make these really serious interventions and really, like Julia said, completely create a new way forward. And I think Alejandra was also talking about a regenerative economy that really pushes us away from these really harmful systems. And so when the infrastructure bill, actually passed and when those negotiations were happening, we put out a statement that said the Senate passes this bipartisan infrastructure bill that locks Indian country into decades of fossil fuel infrastructure and false solutions. And I think it's just so important to see that this is really a way this fits into neoliberalism, because this is really a way of maintaining the status quo and perpetuating this sort of white supremacy, this capitalistic system, and colonization, these extensions of colonization into the future, so that our future generations have to deal with this too. And so, one of the things about neoliberalism that I think a lot of people tend to push to the wayside is the way that it really breeds apathy and really tricks us into believing that everything is okay now. And I think that could not be further from the truth, because we see the ways that these people are benefiting off of, our suffering. And so, I think that, I don't really have a lot to add from what Julia and Alejandra and Marta was saying, but I really think that some of the solutions that we need to be driving forward and some of the work that we're doing at IEN, in addition to, bringing up people like Julia, I see Thomas Joseph is on this call as well, and making sure that our frontline communities have the tools and resources to teach their communities what false solutions are and what they look like, and the tricks and the languages that these people are using in order to trick our communities into falling victim or being prey to a lot of their schemes. So we really are going to be, with the onslaught of these false solutions that we know our people are going to be facing and having to fight over the next decade, we are pushing out a really robust train the trainers program, so that we can get more people like Julia, like Alejandra, like Thomas Joseph, like others into the communities, so that we can make sure that we know that our people can defend themselves and have the knowledge and have the resources and skill sets to understand what's happening, to understand the manipulation that's happening through these programs. The work that I'm really focused on this year especially is really trying to drive forward free, prior, informed consent codification, both through executive action, and we're doing a lot of that work in a space called Build Back Fossil Free, as well as in the Green New Deal Network, and also through legislative action as well, because we understand that, if President Biden, if we are successful and we are able to get him to codify or to push forward an executive order around free, prior, informed consent, if Trump comes back into office, he could just take it away. And so we're going to make sure that that is actually codified and put into law. And we're really excited that we're working with Representative Cori Bush and Senator Ed Markey on some work around this. And so we think that also rolling out, and like Julia said, there is this mobilization around just transition and work in just transition. And we're also rolling out Indigenous principles of just transition, because we really want to make sure that those who are most impacted by these policies, most impacted by these decisions, most impacted by these harms are at the table, are centered in these decisions going forward. And from what our experiences, from the work that we do with our grassroots communities, we see that they're already doing the work to implement the solutions. They just don't have the tools and the resources and the funding necessary to actually implement it on a wider scale. And so I think that that's just really important to recognize that for nonprofits, our role really should be to look to grassroots solutions, to look to frontline solutions. And really, it's challenging because we have to do that ourselves. Like even at Indigenous Environmental Network, we need to do this work of stepping back, uplifting and centering the front lines, and making sure that we're not perpetuating these harmful systems of neoliberalism, of capitalism, of colonization and white supremacy ourselves. And some of that really does involve, divesting from power. And that is as simple as that sounds, it really is really difficult for a lot of people to hear, because it really does involve, for some of these larger organizations, putting those resources into the communities that are already doing the work, maybe taking a step back, not putting the branding on every single action that they show up to, maybe letting the front lines go ahead and lead that action in whatever way that they seem best fit. And also, putting over the platform, because I think, one of the things that Marta said that I think is so important, and it's one of the things that we're recognizing and we're building capacity around, is that it really is important to win this narrative in the court of public opinion. A lot of this, like Julia said, is actually just made up. And so when we're having these conversations in political spaces where other big greens are in and they're trying to push back against us, whether it be, I'll just name them, groups like Evergreen or Sierra Club or Sunrise Movement, it's really important to just say, hey, stop right there. This is not, these are not within the window of impossibility. And I think that language is used a lot to really try to silence and dismiss the work that Indigenous communities, frontline communities, Black communities, impacted communities are already doing to fight against the harms that they're facing every day. And so I think, for any of the, nonprofit groups that are on here, I'm just challenging us to go back and do that work and to recognize that we do wield power by holding that status as nonprofit, existing in the nonprofit industrial complex, which is very much a part of this capitalistic system that we are trying to eradicate and move away from. And so, I think I'm really excited to hear, more through the discussion. And I think, this accountability piece is really important. And that's a lot of the work that I'm responsible for in my organization, and a lot of other folks are doing great work around false solutions and making sure that we're training folks to train other people, because that's also, an emblem of, and a piece of white supremacy is, gatekeeping knowledge, gatekeeping resources, and gatekeeping skills. And so I think, by having this robust program, by really rolling out this Train the Trainers program, I'm really excited to see the way that, our communities who are facing these carbon pipelines, facing these hydrogen hubs, facing, these false solutions in the Gulf South are able to really, step back, build that people power, really change and take control of the public narrative, and recognize that, we have the power, we have the ability to fight back against this. This is all, fake conversations, happening in Congress around these false solutions. And so we can, move in there and have these real conversations. And it really just involves recognizing the ways that we perpetuate these very harmful, powerful power imbalances, and the way that we can right set that. And, I think that for us, a lot of that really is through Indigenous just transition, recognizing Indigenous principles and traditional ecological knowledge as well. and really just putting the power, putting the resources, and putting the faith into, our grassroots and our frontlines communities who are already showing us the way. And so, I just want to say Niawe and thank you, everybody. And I'm excited to go ahead and move forward into more discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, Ashley. You really have let us pave open up the path for us to really dig into the solutions and the strategies and the things that are inspiring communities, frontline communities, to fight back, right? And just like there are emerging threats and false solutions on the horizon looming large, there are also all these exciting emergent and transformative regenerative solutions too that are igniting people and catalyzing action. So I think one of the key questions that all of you have touched on and beautifully is, what are those solutions, those tactics, those strategies that are really firing you up and that you see on the horizon, just like these threats are on the horizon, like you see these little sparks that are yes, we need to do more of that. We need to invest in that. I heard you Ashley saying we need more train the trainers, more building the power, shifting the narratives. But anything that you can share with the audience about the types of tactics that we need to double down on or that are really exciting to you all. So I'm going to open it up so anyone who has any thoughts on that can throw out ideas.
I'll go. So part of our organization is ensuring that information is accessible. So a lot of the times, the introduction of policy or ruling or whatever it is really embedded in language that is meant to be divisive and confusing. So I know that all of us that work in policy can really speak to the amount of acronyms that are used in these conversations, which, the very beginning of our webinar, people were asking, what is CCS? What are these things? And so what we find ourselves doing in Pueblo Action Alliance is ensuring that we as an organization can obtain this information, break it down in something accessible, and then give it back out to our communities. And that's exactly what we envision doing with all of this information that we obtained from the training that we attended with IEN and CJA and other folks that were really, trying to make sure that grassroots-led organizations had the tools in order to take back to their community. And so last year was actually the first year that we were able to have a conference that was just for the grassroots organizations. And we brought all of these organizations from all over the state of New Mexico, working on fracking, working on uranium, working on soils. And now we're really trying to bring in folks that are working in water and our farmers that work in ag, because all of these false solutions can come up in so many different ways. And so the way to mobilize power, we feel, is by empowering our communities with information. And then they could feel the empowerment to do something civically or directly or even spiritually about it. And so we can't undermine the education, educate to liberate. That's exactly the premise of our organization. And it is a tactic. It's a grassroots tactic. The more that we know about these industries, the more that we can identify them coming up in different policies that, we either support or we either don't support. And I think that's actually what has even been happening with some of the Native and Brown-led organizations that have been co-opted by these big greens and, are being tokenized to be well, look, there's these Brown organizations that support net zero, why can't you? And for us, it's well, you're not educating them enough to understand that this is a market-based mechanism. it isn't going to mitigate climate change. It isn't going to help us adapt to this changing climate that we're going to see in the future. It's just allowing you to continue bringing in money, saying that you're diversifying your membership, but ultimately not doing anything in the end. So I just can't speak enough on how important it is to like bring this information back to communities so that way they understand and they can see it coming for themselves.
Yeah, I don't know if any of the other panelists wanted to offer up any other things that were exciting them or tactics that they want to double down on. I know Leo's also been tracking some of the questions in the in the chat, so he has some juicy questions too that have emerged. But before we move on.
Well, you know, I think there's also something to think about in terms of kind of who controls the pace of the work that we do. And I think that, you know, I mean, I sit in the Green New Deal Network space with Ashley, and, you know, and see sort of the way in which the, you know, policy decisions, agendas, organizing strategies, political strategies get dictated, you know, by the, you know, by essentially, you know, the pace of, you know, of corporate corruption and political, you know, political influence. And, you know, for instance, like with the Build Back Better agenda this year, you know, the whole thing was presented as though it was going to be a fait accompli within, you know, within 6 weeks or something like that. And it was really this artificial deadline created by, you know, this, you know, the sort of the party establishment and the corporate donors that were driving it, in a way that sort of forced everybody in the, you know, I mean, both big greens, you know, well, you know, but also ended up dragging the rest of us along with having to, you know, to try to influence this, you know, this major legislation as though it was the last chance we could ever do anything, and to do it, you know, with almost no time to actually get it right. And it got loaded up with all of these false solutions in the process of that. And, you know, so I think, you know, I think we need to be prepared as a movement to move at our own pace, and not necessarily to move slowly, but, you know, but to do the base building, to do, you know, to develop the, and advance the frontline leadership, and you know, and to ground the work in, you know, the really, sort of, you know, human stories that we have about the way that these, about the way that these issues, you know, affect people. And I think that there actually is a lot of power to slowing things down. And, you know, what we saw, for instance, just happening with the things that were happening, you know, with the nuclear policies that were being promoted through the bipartisan bill and Build Back Better, is the longer this fight went on, the more we were able, you know, to get, voices into, policymakers, more we were able to foreground these stories, and actually the more we were able to cut back the amount of the billions of dollars that were being put in there. But the whole process had been corrupted from the start. And I think that's something that we really need to take to heart.
Yeah, I just want to jump in really quick and say one tactic that we're really excited about at IEN, in addition to the Train the Trainers, is really just doing that community building work of connecting our different fights who are fighting against false solutions. And so we're really excited to be partnering and doing some work and showing out for and showing up as allies for our relatives in the Gulf South for a Green New Deal, who are fighting against false solutions in the Gulf South. And they're planning a really large mobilization this summer. And we're really excited to really connect their fight with our fight up north, and our fight with our relatives in New Mexico, to really just build that cross movement people power, and just show the solidarity between, you know, Black and Indigenous frontline communities who really are on the front lines of the climate crisis and these false solutions. And so I'm excited to really build the power.
Yeah, I just wanted to also jump in really quick, because I had a conversation with one of the audience members after I spoke about, you know, so what are the solutions, right? How are we building power? Are we lobbying? Are we involving Indigenous leaders? How are you guys doing it in New Mexico? And I think, you know, we have been talking also about this piece on wind and solar, right? And not all wind and solar projects are created equally. As Julia put it very frankly, we have to decentralize the power. I mean, any kind, this is why people have been talking about cooperatives for a while, right? But when we talk about energy democracy, it has to be coming from the hands of the community. And that's why those artificial deadlines, right? Like the net zero by 2030, like that's all at the political whim, and it doesn't include any of these things to actually build the power. And I think that that's why we had to get in front of these narratives and say, yeah, we want wind and solar, but also at the same time, it should be at the hands of people who are going to be affected by this, right? And in New Mexico, that should be the indigenous stakeholders, those who are tied to land and water, and who actually would have the land for solar panels, right? And then you would allow folks to, so I know in New York that they've been doing, it's Public Power New York, and they've been talking about this. And it's like, so, you know, you could dictate the management of that storage, not just wind and solar projects here and there that have nothing to do with the people, and they're just private public partnerships that don't actually change the system. And that's what we need to do. We have to build interruptions and change the narrative, because we're putting so much money into net zero, into CCS, into hydrogen and unproven technology. And what are states like New Mexico going to do? We already know that the science doesn't prove that this works. So what are we going to do when we're 10 years down the line and we're stuck with this remedial, horrible science? It's going to be like uranium and nuclear all over again.
Yeah, I don't know if Martha, you wanted to offer any other thoughts.
Well, you know, I think that, you know, building this this international solidarity on, you know, stopping the false solutions, you know, for us in California, it's like we realize we don't, you know, at some point we thought we had legislative champions, but they're gone and we don't have them, right? So we managed to push back on a bill at the end of session because we weren't paying attention. And then we see this bill and we sort of, you know, I didn't care because, you know, I don't care. And I remember sort of the tension around saying, no, I hardline, oppose this bill, but we can have guardrails. No, oppose the bill. And we got caught up in the shiny object of, oh, maybe we can do some guardrails, but, you know, and I'm like, you know, no, what we need to build in is things that delay the process on the ground while we were also fighting for the things that we want. So the EJ groups in California just developed a whole set of recommendations for CARB that we are calculating gets us to 80%, 83% of the emissions reductions that we need without using carbon capture, right? Focus on direct emissions reductions. But the other part of is like, how do we get out? What is the next one, right? That is going to come at me, and I don't want to feel like I'm not ready, or that we are not ready as a movement, because then, you know, that's a challenge. And then the other thing is, I think there's a moment right now where we actually need to push back on the big greens in a very public way, because from building decarbonization to green hydrogen to carbon capture and sequestration, all of these, you know, neoliberal policies, they're incredibly well funded, right? So I'm in a meeting with the Sierra Club and they've got like 5 staff, right? And yet they're pushing things that are, you know, really going to end up, you know, damaging our communities, because we always know it's not centered on justice. It means that we're going to bear the burdens and none of the benefits. So, you know, I'm wondering how we can think through as a movement what we do in both to stop funding people to do stupid things. Right?
I love that, Martha. Let's stop the stupid. Yes, well, we just have a little bit of time left. So I thought, you know, in these last few moments, if you have any campaigns or, you know, any specific policies or campaigns you want people in the audience to plug into or be aware of, you can either put it in the chat or please share it with us now. We want to make sure that we're supporting, like, you know, all of the frontline solutions and active campaigns right now that you all are engaged with. Yeah, and you guys can put it in the chat if you want, if that's easier. Maybe that's easier to just plug it in there. and share it with folks so that, yeah, if there's things that you want people to sign on to or bills you want people to be aware of, this would be really useful to get people sort of in a call to action and call people in into some good work. All right, I think we just have a few minutes, so maybe we'll go into, unless there's anything else the panelists would like to share that we haven't had a chance to touch on, we might go into our closing. I'm just gonna pause for a minute and make sure there's nothing we've left unsaid on the that's burning. All right, so I really want to thank our panelists for giving so generously of their time and their wisdom with us, and for all of those who participated with us on the panel. And I'm going to turn it over to Leo. I know there's a bunch of reminders and thank yous that he's going to share with us in our closing, but thank you so much for being in this community with us in this time. Thank you.
Kamati, thank you, Anna, sincerely for helping us make this conversation such a fruitful and timely one. And my profound thanks to everyone in this panel, Marta, Alejandria, Ashley, Julia, Tim. It is the work of folks like you and the organizations and communities you organize and you build relations and mobilize with that creates the real alternatives and pathways for us to have hope and vision for the kind of world we want to build outside of these very damaging systems of oppression. So one thing I wanted before we close to share with the audience a few reminders. Please, if you haven't done so, I invite you to pick up the Hoodwinked in the Hothouse 3rd edition booklet. This is truly a condensation of a very, very vast experience and knowledge built out from the communities, frontline organizers, indigenous communities, and critical thinking that is key to address the climate issues of our day and to move us beyond them. Please, if you haven't done so, take time to do that. Also, take the time to visit climatefallsolutions.org, where in addition to the booklet, you can find other resources. Check out the first webinar that we put together on this topic. There's also a second webinar. These webinars are shared in that website, as well as in the YouTube channel of the Indigenous Environmental Network and the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. This is a series of webinars where we systematically engage with this fall solutions in different areas as they occur globally and nationally. So we will continue on addressing other aspects of these debates in upcoming webinars, so pay attention. We will be in contact, reaching out to folks who have been part of this audience to continue engaging with us, continue connecting with the campaigns, with the actions, sharing resources and reading up on what has been shared here by panelists and by the audience. Very valuable, very important resources for movement building and relationship building. Also, we will be sending out a Google Doc with resources from this panel, from the organizations that are represented here, so folks can follow up with key issues, learn more, join campaigns and actions, so on and so forth. Finally, I want to give special thanks to our supporting team that has made this this event possible. Laura Langner, particularly, pulled up, has really done a lot of work in helping this happen. Kaya Xiao, Tipna Kliegler, Ananda Lee Tan, and from Just Transition Alliance, we have a big event. We have the folks from Indigenous Environmental Network that have also helped make this possible. Shah, thanks to everyone for making this. And if I've missed anybody, please, my sincere apologies. This is a very important collective effort. And all of the organizations in the climatefallsolutions.org coalition have been the key drivers to this debate. So please check out what's happening there. There will be recordings sent out of this webinar, linked to a recording. You will be able to check it out on the web pages, IEN, Indigenous Environmental Network, climatefallsolutions.org, Tishman Environment Design Center. And with that, I'd like to close once again. Have a great rest of your evening, wherever you're joining us from. And we look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Wonderful to be with all of you.
This was wonderful all. Have a good night.